My family and I used to live in a rough neighborhood when I was a kid. One night it was just my mom, my two siblings, and I at home, and my dad was gone on a business trip. Around midnight, someone started knocking on our door. My mom woke up, went to the front door, and asked who it was. No one answered. She thought that maybe it was some kids playing ding-dong ditch, so she went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, again, someone starts knocking. She gets up and peers through the side window to see if she can spot anyone out there. But nobody is there. She starts to worry, so she goes back to the room, grabs my dad's double barrel, and sits in the living room in the dark, waiting. Then more knocking. My mom begins shouting at whoever it is that she is going to call the cops and that if anyone tries to come in, she would shoot them. At about 2 a.m., the police finally show up and do a quick search outside of our house while we waited inside. After their search, they tell my mom that they had found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long next to the front door and asked if it belonged to my mom. She said that it wasn't hers and asked why. The cop told her it belonged to whoever was knocking on the door, that they were planning on strangling my mom with the barbed wire when she opened the door to see who was knocking. They said that she was very smart to not open the door to see who was there, otherwise it could have a big cost. The cops said that they'd patrol the neighborhood until morning and do a thorough investigation once there was daylight. That morning, as they were searching around the house, they found footprints leading around to the back of the house and up to my bedroom window. They had also found nicks in the windowsill where the person was trying to pry it open to break in but failed. My mom always suspected it was this one neighbor, because he would always stare at my mom through his curtains and wasn't very friendly. He also knew when my dad wasn't home, since he knows what vehicle he drives. We moved out of that house after that. Me and my family moved to a quieter neighborhood on the outskirts of town, where the streets were lined with trees and the houses had well-kept lawns. For a while, we felt safe again. I remember the feeling of waking up in the morning without a knot in my stomach and the sound of birds chirping outside my window. My mom seemed more relaxed too, and I even caught her humming while she did the dishes. But the memory of that night never really left us. A reminder that danger could be just around the corner, and you have to be prepared. A few months after we moved, I started noticing strange things around our new house. It began with small, almost imperceptible signs. A window that I was sure I had closed left slightly opened. Footprints in the garden that none of us could account for. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but then my brother, Jake, mentioned that he had heard noises outside his window at night. My mom dismissed it as squirrels or raccoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as the sun was setting, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I wanted to familiarize myself with the new surroundings and reassure myself that everything was fine. As I turned the corner onto our street, I noticed a man standing at the end of the block. He was wearing a dark hoodie, and his face was partially obscured by the dark. He seemed to be watching me. I quickened my pace and hurried home, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. By the time I reached our front door, he was gone, but the uneasy feeling remained. I told my mom about the man, but she assured me that it was probably just someone out for a walk. "The people around here are friendly," she said. "It's nothing like the old neighborhood." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. That night, I laid in my bed, listening to the house settle and the occasional car pass by. Every creak and rustle set my nerves on edge. A week later, the knocking started again. It was late, just past midnight, and I was the first to hear it. I nudged my mom awake, my heart pounding in my chest. She grabbed my dad's old double barrel, which she had kept for protection, and we crept into the living room together. The knocking was steady, insistent. My mom peered through the peephole but saw no one. She shouted through the door, warning whoever it was that she was armed and would shoot. The knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. We called the police, and when they arrived, they did a thorough search around the house. They didn't find anything this time, no footprints or discarded weapons. But the sense of violation was the same. The officers advised us to install a security system, which we did the very next day. Cameras, motion sensors, stuff like that. It made us feel a bit more secure, but I could tell that my mom was struggling to keep her composure. The fear was eating away at her, just as it was at me. One night, a few weeks after the new security system was installed, we were woken by the alarm blaring. The sound was piercing, and it took a moment for my groggy brain to process what was happening. My mom grabbed the shotgun and motioned for us to stay in our rooms. She moved swiftly through the house, checking the windows and doors, but found nothing out of place. The police arrived shortly after, but once again, they found no signs of an intruder. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in our home was palpable. My brothers and I started having nightmares, and my mom looked exhausted all the time. It felt like we were living in a prison of our own making, constantly on edge, waiting for the next knock on the door. My dad's business trips became less frequent, and when he was home, he installed more locks and reinforced the windows. He even considered getting a guard dog, but my mom was hesitant, not wanting to add even more chaos. One afternoon, while I was doing homework in the kitchen, I heard a soft tapping at the back door. I froze with my heart racing. The tapping continued slowly. I mustered the courage to peek through the curtain, and to my horror, I saw the same man from before, standing there with a sinister smile on his face. And his face was creepy as hell. Imagine a big-ass creepy smile, man. I still don't know if this was the same neighbor my mom didn't like. He lifted his hand to knock again, and I screamed for my mom. She came running, shotgun in hand, but by the time she reached the door, he was gone. We showed the security footage to the police, and they confirmed that it was the same man from the previous incidents. They launched an investigation and promised to keep a closer watch on our neighborhood. But I knew that as long as he was out there, we would never truly be safe. The fear had taken root deep within us, a constant reminder that the past can always come back to haunt you. Hey, I'm Matt. My neighbor was living with his parents his whole life because he couldn't work due to some psychological disorder. I don't know what it was exactly, but he walked around his house all day and looks at it from all possible angles. He watched his house or his car in the garage all day. Sometimes he was watching from inside, just staring outside absently. When you walked past him and greet him, he never answered. Doesn't even seem to notice you. Sometimes he walked around the block with his old leather suitcase and sunglasses on. He returned quickly all the time. When he recognized something which is not right, he calls the police. Even when someone turned around the car in his driveway or parks near it. When I was a child and we had birthday parties where the parents parked their cars near his driveway to collect their children, he nearly always called the police. When I come home late at night, his front door was always open a little bit with him sitting behind and watching. Sometimes when friends were over and we go for a smoke outside at night, he used to come outside and go to his garage. He got very bright lights installed and pretends to check his car. At night, like 4 a.m., it's kind of disturbing, but you get used to it from time to time. On the other hand, we never feared any burglars breaking into our house, because we knew our neighbor was there watching. Sometimes I wondered about his life inside that house. I imagined rooms filled with old furniture, a quiet television flickering in the background, and maybe a radio softly playing tunes from decades past. There was something about him that made it seem like he was stuck in a different era, unable to move forward. One late evening, curiosity got the better of me. I was standing outside, smoking a cigarette, when I saw him again, peering out from his front door, with his silhouette just barely visible in the dim light. For a moment our eyes met, and an inexplicable impulse made me wave. To my surprise, he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate motion and waved back. It was the first acknowledgement I'd ever received from him. It was pretty cool. The next day, I decided to bake some cookies. I thought it might be a kind gesture, a way to bridge the gap that had always existed between us. So I did. I walked over to his house with a plate of cookies in hand and knocked on the door. There was a long pause, and just when I thought he wouldn't answer, the door creaked open. He stood there, looking at me with those same distant eyes. "Hey, I'm your neighbor," I started, feeling awkward. "I made some cookies and thought you might like some." His gaze shifted from me to the plate of cookies. For a moment, I wasn't sure if he even understood what I was saying. Then, he stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. Hesitantly, I entered his house. The air was thick with the scent of old books and something musty. The living room was just as I had imagined, filled with antique furniture and dusty shelves. An old television set flickered in the corner, casting eerie shadows across the room. He motioned for me to sit down on a really old-looking couch, its springs creaking under my weight. He took the plate of cookies and set it on a small wooden table, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he hovered near the window, peering out as if expecting something. "I'm Matt. Nice to meet you," I said, trying to break the silence. "I live next door." He nodded slowly but remained silent. The awkwardness grew, and I glanced around, looking at the odd decorations, faded photographs, porcelain figurines, and strange trinkets that looked out of place in a modern home. "Do you live here alone?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He turned to face me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "My parents," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "They're here." A chill ran down my spine. I had never seen his parents, not once in all the years I had lived next door. Before I could ask further, he walked over to a door at the far end of the room and opened it. The smell that wafted out was almost unbearable, a mix of decay and something else I couldn't identify. He gestured for me to follow, and against my better judgment, I did. We walked down a narrow hallway, the walls lined with more faded photographs and old, dusty wallpaper. The house felt like a labyrinth, each turn leading deeper into darkness. At the end of the hall was another door, which he unlocked with an old, rusty key. As the door creaked open, I braced myself for what I might see. Inside was a dimly lit room, its walls covered in more old photographs. In the center of the room were two armchairs facing a large window. Seated in the chairs were two figures, motionless and silent. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were his parents, or what was left of them. Their bodies were mummified, their skin stretched tight over their bones, their eyes hollow and empty. "They keep me company," he said softly, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "They've always been here." I took a step back, with my freaking heart pounding in my chest. The reality of what I was seeing felt like a nightmare. I swear. He must have noticed my fear because he smiled, a slow, unsettling, creepy-ass smile. "You can leave," he said almost kindly. "But you must promise not to tell anyone. They wouldn't understand." I nodded, barely able to breathe. Slowly, I backed out of the room, down the hallway, and through the living room. He followed me to the front door, watching me with those distant eyes. As soon as I was outside, I bolted, running back to my house as fast as I could. For days after, I avoided going outside too much, afraid of seeing him again. The memory of his parents' bodies haunted my dreams. I considered calling the police, but every time I picked up the phone, his words echoed in my mind. "Don't tell anyone, they wouldn't understand." Weeks passed, and the neighborhood remained quiet. He continued his usual routine, but now I noticed the subtle changes. The way he looked at his house, his car, and the street. It was as if he was watching for something or someone. And late at night, when everything was still, I sometimes heard faint, muffled voices coming from his house. One evening, I mustered the courage to look through his window. There he was, sitting in the living room, talking to his parents as if they were alive. He would pause as if listening to their responses, then nod and continue. It was a chilling sight. That shit filled me with a sense of dread that I hope I never go through again. I began to notice other strange occurrences, small things at first. My mail went missing, only to be found neatly stacked on my porch days later. Objects in my yard were moved, rearranged. And always, I felt eyes on me watching from somewhere. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of my front door creaking open. I froze, listening intently. Footsteps echoed softly through my hallway, drawing closer. My heart raced, and I reached for the baseball bat I had under my bed. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door, and the knob began to turn slowly. I held my breath, gripping the bat tightly. The door creaked open, and there he stood, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come into my house," he whispered. "Now they want to visit you." As he advanced, the shadows seemed to close in around me, suffocating and cold. I raised the bat, ready to defend myself. He reached out with his hand, and then everything went black. When I woke, I was in my own bed, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, eerily so. I stumbled out of bed, checking every room, every corner, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had never been there, so I strongly hoped it was just a nightmare. From that night on, my life changed. I told my parents about this, but they agreed to just leave it alone, as they were kinda sorry for him too. Every time I think of this, I kinda get freaked out. At the time, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things and left, abandoning the house I had grown up in. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the memory of him saying, "They've always been here." Hi, I'll begin the story already, 'cause I don't want to take your time. I used to be friends with these ladies, a mom and daughter, across the hall. I was a single mom going to school. I was 24 then. The daughter was in her mid-30s or so, and the mom was late 50s. We would chat in the hall, and my daughter would bring them flowers sometimes, or we would pet their cute dogs. They were very kind. One day, I noticed a piece of paper next to my front door inside my house. I picked it up, and it said, "Call me sometime," from Joey, with a phone number. I was confused how it got in my apartment at all, because the seal around my door was pretty good. I'm guessing it was stuck in the seal, and I opened the door and didn't notice it fall in. I bumped into the mom and daughter later that day and showed them the note and asked if they knew a Joey and if that was meant for one of them. The daughter looked at it, then at her mom, and the mom kinda laughed and said, "Well, he's supposed to be my boyfriend, but if you want him, honey, you can have him." And I said, "Oh no, I'm definitely not interested," and I felt really awkward about it, especially because I had never even seen this guy, but apparently he had seen me. Later, the daughter came over and told me I was an adult and welcome to date whoever. And again I said I was not interested in Mystery Joey, but that she just wanted to warn me he had gotten in trouble for exposing himself to kids at Walmart and to look out for myself and my daughter. I appreciated her warning and never had to deal with Joey. Thank God, but I definitely had a plan in case I did. I ended up moving out, and the mom ended up accidentally causing a fire that badly injured her and fatally injured their 3 dogs. She had a problem with pills and would often knock herself out. This time she did it when she was frying something. After the unsettling incident with Weirdo Joey and the tragic fire, I wanted nothing more than to leave behind the memories and the anxiety that had tainted what was once a peaceful home. My daughter and I relocated to a small, charming house in a quieter neighborhood. It was far enough from the city to feel serene, but close enough for me to commute to school and manage my daily routine. One morning, as I was sipping my cappuccino and watching the leaves flutter down from the trees outside my window, I noticed a familiar face walking down the street. It was the daughter from across the hall. We exchanged a wave, and she approached my porch with a tentative smile. I invited her in, and over cappuccino, she filled me in on what had happened after the fire. The mom had survived, thanks God, but was in a rehabilitation center, recovering from severe burns and grappling with her addiction. The daughter had moved to the same neighborhood as I had, hoping to support her mom's recovery. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the simpler times and acknowledging the shadows that had passed between us. There was an unspoken understanding that, despite everything, we were grateful to have reconnected. As days turned into weeks, we fell into a comfortable routine of support. She would watch my daughter when I had late classes, and I would help her with errands for her mom. It was during one of these late-night talks that she revealed more about Joey. "Joey wasn't always like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He used to be a good man before his life fell apart. Lost his job, his family, everything. He started drinking, and things went downhill from there. I think that's why my mom felt sorry for him, why she let him hang around." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But that doesn't excuse what he did." Her confession left me with mixed emotions. I felt a pang of pity for Joey, but the fear he instilled in me was hard to shake off. I didn't dwell on it, though. I focused on the present and the small joys it brought. One evening, as I was reading my daughter a bedtime story, there was a knock at the door. It was the daughter again, looking more anxious than I'd ever seen her. She hurriedly explained that Joey had been released from jail and was reportedly seen in our neighborhood. My heart raced. All the old fears resurfaced, but I knew I had to stay calm for my daughter's sake. We formulated a plan. I installed additional locks and security cameras, and she promised to keep a lookout. The community, though small, was tight-knit and quickly spread the word to be vigilant. Those nights were sleepless, filled with fear. One night, I heard a noise outside my window. My pulse quickened as I peered through the curtains. A shadow moved in the darkness, then disappeared. I immediately called the police, and within minutes, the neighborhood was alive with flashing lights and concerned neighbors. Joey was found lurking in the bushes a few houses down. He was arrested and taken away, but the incident left a scar on our sense of security. Life slowly returned to normal, but we were more cautious, more aware of our surroundings. The daughter and I often spoke about moving forward and not letting the past dictate our future. It was easier said than done, but with time, the fear subsided, replaced by a cautious optimism. Months later, we received news that Joey had been sentenced to a long-term facility where he could receive the help he needed. It was a sweet moment. The relief we felt was amazing. We focused on the positive, the safety it ensured for our community. My daughter, blissfully unaware of the full extent of the danger, thrived in her new school and made many friends. Her laughter was a healing balm to my frayed nerves. The daughter, too, found solace in helping her mom through recovery. We had both emerged stronger from our trials, bonded by adversity. Reflecting on everything, I realized how far we'd come. From the awkwardness of Weirdo Joey's note to the terror of his presence, we had navigated a labyrinth of emotions and emerged resilient. The daughter's courage in facing her past and my determination to protect my own showed me that strength comes in many forms. Together, we built a new sense of home, one rooted in trust and fortified by the support we provided each other. And then life continued, as it always does, with its ups and downs, but I knew we could handle anything as long as we faced it together. When I was in high school, there were a few disturbing occurrences in my neighborhood. A woman down the street who lived alone woke up one night to go to the bathroom and heard her TV on in the living room. So she naturally wandered in there, assuming nothing out of the ordinary. But then she found a guy sitting on her couch watching the TV. She started screaming, obviously terrified, and the guy ran out of her house. Maybe a week later, further down the street, there was a family with a young daughter. She woke up in the middle of the night with her bedsheets pulled down and a guy tickling her feet. Again, started screaming, and the guy fled. Another week or so later, 3 houses down where an elderly couple lived, the husband woke up in the middle of the night to find a man standing over his bed and staring at his wife sleeping. The old man started hollering at this guy, and the guy fled again. So now shit is on super high alert. Cops patrolling regularly and all kinds of things like that. They somehow figured out who it was, and everyone in the neighborhood got a flyer with his picture. Behind us was a densely wooded area that stretches for a couple of miles in every direction. This guy had been literally living in those woods for upwards of a month in a tent, doing God only knows what when he wasn't breaking into houses. But the creepiest part of the story is this. One night in the middle of all these incidents, we had our sliding glass door open with just the screen door behind it shut. This was in the summer. We had a big backyard and it was pitch black back there at night. Our dog suddenly jolted up and started growling viciously, like I'm talking tail stiff as a board, hair on his neck standing up, things like that. Our dog was the best, nicest dog, like, ever. He never did that. So naturally we were like, what the hell? My father jumped up and put the floodlight over the deck on to see what was back there. But there was nothing. The next morning, we were outside doing yard work and noticed the lock on our back gate was broken. Someone had clearly done it. It wasn't like it was wear and tear or something like that. It's very safe to assume that this guy had tried to get into our backyard and our house but was deterred by my dog's growling/barking. In the following days, my anxiety skyrocketed. Every creak and groan of our house seemed amplified, each one a potential harbinger of the intruder's return. I started double-checking locks and windows, something I'd never bothered with before. My parents tried to downplay the situation, reassuring me that the police were on it and that our dog would alert us to any danger. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard something outside my window. My room faced the backyard. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound that might betray an intruder's presence. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly crept out of bed and edged toward the window. I lifted the blind just a fraction, peeking out into the backyard. I scanned the perimeter, from shadow to shadow, but I saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to lower the blind, a flash of movement caught my eye. I froze. There, at the far end of the yard, a dark figure seemed to meld with the trees, almost indistinguishable from the shadows themselves. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it had to be him. Panicking, I backed away from the window, nearly tripping over a pile of clothes on my floor. I stumbled out of my room and ran to my parents' door, banging on it with desperate urgency. My father opened the door, with his face as a mix of concern and grogginess. "Dad, he's out there," I whispered frantically. "I saw him in the backyard." We both rushed to the kitchen, where my dad grabbed the flashlight from the counter. He cautiously unlocked the back door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The cold night air rushed in, and I shivered, though not entirely from the temperature. My father stepped out onto the deck, sweeping the flashlight beam across the yard. The powerful light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the shed, and finally, the far end of the yard where I had seen the figure. But we found nothing. No sign of movement, no intruder lurking in the shadows. My father continued to search, methodically checking every corner of the backyard. He even walked to the back gate, testing the new lock we had installed just days earlier. It held firm. After what felt like hours, he came back inside, closing and locking the door behind him. "There's no one out there, kiddo," he said softly. It was probably just your imagination, but I just knew what I had seen. The figure, the rustling, there was no mistaking it. I returned to my room, still on edge, and stayed awake for the rest of the night, my mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened if our dog hadn't been there to scare the guy off. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood's vigilance only increased. The police set up a more permanent presence, patrolling regularly and even setting up checkpoints at the neighborhood's entrances. Despite their efforts, the sense of unease remained. People were suspicious of anyone they didn't recognize. One day, while walking home from school, I noticed a group of kids huddled around something near the edge of the woods behind our neighborhood. Curious, I approached them and saw what had captured their attention. A makeshift campsite, partially hidden by the dense foliage. There was a tattered tent, a charred fire pit, and scattered belongings, a haunting reminder of the intruder's presence. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized just how close he had been, living in those woods while we went about our daily lives, oblivious to his lurking menace. I hurried home, eager to put as much distance between myself and that campsite as possible. That evening, I couldn't shake the image of the campsite from my mind. The thought that he might still be out there, watching us from the cover of the trees. I shared my discovery with my parents, who promptly called the police. The officers who arrived took my report seriously, combing through the woods and dismantling the campsite. Yet they found no trace of the intruder himself. It was as if he had vanished. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the memory of those disturbing events stayed with us. I developed even more love and appreciation for our dog, Albert, who had undoubtedly saved us from a potential nightmare. Every night, as I locked the doors and windows, I felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension, aware of how fragile our sense of security could be. Years later, I still think about those nights and the terrifying reality of having an intruder so close to home. It taught me the importance of vigilance and the value of a loyal, loving, and protective pet. Though the man was never caught, the experience left an indelible mark on our community. After those things, we packed everything and moved from the city, and our lovely silly dog Albert is still with us. That's a crazy story. So, my parents and I used to have a neighbor that was obsessed with my mom. Like literally, man. It was innocent enough at first. He was just nice and they'd have small conversations. They became friendly and we would invite him over for barbecues and everything. Then he started to get creepy. Every single time my mom would take the dog out, he would appear outside and want to talk her. He would find an excuse to come knock on our door every single day. He got the same haircut and grew the same goatee as my dad and started to dress like my dad. He then went and bought the exact same type of motorcycle as my dad. I was like, bro, nah, what the fuck? He started showing up at my mom's work, bringing her lunch and flowers. That's when my dad had to confront him and it almost became physical. He has mostly stayed away since then. It was a relief when he started to keep his distance, but the tension in our household remained. We were all on edge, especially my mom. She stopped taking the dog out alone, and even though the neighbor wasn't coming around as often, his presence seemed to loom over us like a dark cloud. Every time I saw him outside, I felt a chill run down my spine. He had crossed the line from friendly to obsessive, and none of us knew what he might do next. A few weeks later, strange things started happening. Our mailbox would be open when we knew we had closed it. The backyard gate would be unlatched in the morning. Small, unsettling things that could be easily dismissed if they happened once or twice, but they became too frequent to ignore. My dad installed security cameras around the house, but they never seemed to capture anything definitive. It was as if the neighbor knew exactly where the blind spots were. One night, I was woken up by the sound of rustling outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly crept out of bed and peeked through the curtains. I saw him, crouching by the side of our house, peering into the living room window. I felt a surge of fear and anger, like, how this dude dare invading our privacy like this? I grabbed my phone and took a picture of him before he noticed and scurried away into the darkness. The next morning, I showed the picture to my parents. My dad was livid. He took the evidence to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do since he hadn't actually committed a crime. It was infuriating. We felt trapped in our own home, constantly looking over our shoulders. My mom was especially anxious, and it was taking a toll on her. I could see the stress etched on her face every day. We decided to take matters into our own hands. My dad arranged a meeting with the other neighbors to discuss what was happening. It turned out we weren't the only ones who had noticed his strange behavior. One neighbor mentioned that they had seen him following my mom to work a few times. Another said they caught him snooping around their yard late at night. It was clear that this man was a danger to the entire neighborhood. With the support of our neighbors, we filed a restraining order against him. It took a few weeks, but eventually, the order was granted. He was legally required to stay away from us, and for a while, things seemed to improve. We saw less and less of him, and my mom started to relax a bit. The sense of normalcy was returning, and we hoped this nightmare was finally over. However, it wasn't long before we realized he wasn't going to give up that easily. One evening, as we were sitting down for dinner, there was a loud crash outside. We rushed out to find that someone had thrown a brick through our front window. Attached to it was a note with a single, chilling message. "This isn't over." The police were called again, but without direct evidence of who had done it, there was little they could do. The fear and anxiety returned tenfold. My parents decided it was time to take more drastic measures. We packed up and went to stay with relatives in another town for a while, hoping that putting some distance between us and the creepy neighbor would give us some peace. It was a difficult decision, uprooting our lives, but we felt we didn't have too many choices. During our time away, we stayed in close contact with our other neighbors, who kept us updated on any developments. They reported that the weirdo man had been seen less frequently, and it seemed like he might be moving on. After a few months, we decided it was safe to return home. We were cautious, always alert, but it felt good to be back in our own house. Things were quiet for a few months, but the unease never fully went away. One day, while cleaning out the attic, I found a box of old family photos. As I was looking through them, I found a picture of my mom from before I was born. In the background, I could see a young man who looked eerily like our neighbor. It sent a shiver down my spine. Had he been obsessed with my mom for that long? I got legit terrified, man, and speechless. We decided to hire a private investigator to dig into his past. What they found was disturbing. He had a history of fixations on women, restraining orders, and even a few stints in psychiatric facilities. Knowing this confirmed our worst fears, but it also empowered us. We were more determined than ever to ensure he would never bother us again. At the end, he went to a mental hospital where he still stays at to this day.